Ciao ladies and gentlemen, this video is all about fractions, decimals and percentages and basically how you turn each of them into each other. So decimals to fractions, fractions to percentages, percentages to decimals and all the vice versas. This is what this video is about. To begin with, we have to sort of establish what even all of a fraction or all of a decimal or all of a percentage refers to. So if you give it your all, you put in all your effort, you get 100%. So 100% is everything that you have to give in theory, okay? If you have all of something, it doesn't matter whether it refers to a pizza or if it refers to, I don't know, I'm thinking cake, food's on the mind. You have all of something, you have a whole of something, you have one. One is the thing, the decimal, the number that we use to describe all of something. Speaking of pizzas, speaking of cakes, whether or not I take this pizza and split it up into 3 pieces, whether or not I take this pizza and split it up into 4 pieces, or I split it up into 8 pieces. If you have all of it, then you have every single piece of the pizza, the cake, whatever, all of the fractions. You have 3 out of 3, you have 8 out of 8, whatever it is, you will have a fraction that has the same number on the top as it does in the bottom. That will give you all of something. Also, it's worth noting that 3 divided by 3, 8 divided by 8, it's actually the same as 1. Anyway, okay? So remembering that about the fact that a fraction that has the same on the top as the bottom, or a decimal that's just a number 1, or a percentage that's 100%, will allow you to, even from there, be able to make a comparison between the 3 of them. Okay? So I have a few examples here. We have 2 fractions, 2 decimals, 2 percentages, and we're going to talk through the different ways of doing these. Now, some are easier to do than others, so going back to this little diagram, if you wanted to convert a fraction into percentage, you don't have to do that. You know, you don't have to go from a fraction to percentage like that. You could just decide, you know what, I'm going to turn a fraction into a decimal first, and then I know how to turn a decimal into a percentage. So you've got options here. You can either go around the green way or the red way. It doesn't really matter. It's your call. So a fraction, half, I'm going to make reference to pizzas again. So we have half of a pizza here. That is half of a whole. That means that we're going to have half of all of the percent, which means half of 100%, which means 50%. So half, you probably already know this, half is 50%. Okay? As a decimal, if 1 is all of something, a whole of something, then half of that gives us 0.5. Now the question we really want to know is, well, how do you turn this into this? Or how do you turn this into this? And effectively what you're looking to do is a sum that involves either multiplying or dividing, depending on which way you go. And also with percentages, you got this little sign on the end that we're going to have to deal with. So if we turn something into a percentage, for example, this guy appears. Or if we turn a percentage into a decimal or a fraction, for example, this guy disappears. So that's part of this changing process. Now, the first one that I started instinctively was half a pizza. And then I looked at, well, what was half of the 100%? All right, so effectively, if you want to turn a fraction into a percentage, then all you have to do is take this fraction of 100%. So I'm going to write that down. If you're turning a fraction into a percentage, so this is the red one, you're basically going to do the fraction of 100%. And the word of in maths means multiply. So this is a horrible diagram. You're basically going to take the fraction that you started with and multiply it by 100%. So multiplying by 100% is what you do to turn a fraction into a percentage. Just to show it with another example down here, we have 9 over 100. If we multiply that by 100%, that will turn into 9%. Use your calculator if you don't believe me. Then, turning a fraction into a decimal. Well, 2 ways you can look at this. We could turn the percentage into the decimal, or we could turn the fraction into the decimal. Your call. I'm going to go with the fraction first because I know that a fraction is just a division sum in disguise. 1 over 2, a half, is just the sum. 1 divided by 2 that we've not bothered to do yet. It's just easier to say as a half. Okay? What do you get if you do 1 divided by 2? What do we have here? 0.5. If we do 9 divided by 100, if you actually do 9 divided by 100, you will get 0.09. If you want to convert a fraction into a decimal, you just do the division sum. So a fraction into a decimal, you do the division sum. So whatever that may be, top divided by bottom, that's it. Okay? So that's 2 of them done so far. Turning a fraction into either of the others, times 100% to make it a percentage, or just do the division sum, top divided by bottom, to turn it into a decimal. Okay? Next, we have a decimal. So what if we actually start with a decimal like we have here, right? Well, it's a little bit trickier to turn it into a fraction because, well, what division sum do we get that gives an answer of 0.2? If you happen to know any of those answers straight away, then sure, you can just go ahead and write your fraction. But you might find that it's a lot easier to turn a decimal into a percentage because there's something that we do to this number to turn it into this. Now that's something, first of all, we have to give ourselves this percentage sign because we didn't have it before. And the number 0.5, if you times that by 100, becomes the number 50. Well, it just so happens that turning a fraction into a percentage is you times by 100%. Exactly the same thing if you have a decimal. So whenever your answer has to have a percentage, you will have this percent sign on the end, which, give me a moment, you will have that on the end. And both times we're doing the same sum. You're going to multiply by 100. Doesn't matter if you've got a fraction, doesn't matter if you've got a decimal. Okay, so that's 3 out of the 6 so far. So I take that 0.2 and I multiply by 100 and I get 20%. Okay, I could do the same now for this decimal. If I multiply that by 100 and put a percent sign in the end, I'm going to get 105%. Okay. What next? Well, I didn't want to turn this decimal into a fraction, and between you and me, most people don't. I'll show you in a moment, but it's not as easy as turning a decimal into a percentage first, and then turning a percentage into a fraction, because this little sum, or this little sign on the end, percentage, that means divide by 100. So percentage basically turns into a divide by 100. So when we have 50%, if you set this up as a divide by 100, the number that came before it, in this case the 50, is just the number that goes on the top, 50 over 100. Now, for all intents and purposes, that is the fraction of 50%. It just so happens that it can be written nicer, it can be written simpler, which is where this thing comes about. All right, 20%, exactly the same thing. We can write that as 20, and we just change the percent sign itself into over 100. So we could write 20 over 100 here, or we can simplify it. You end up with, fully simplified, it will be 1/5. Now, knowing to turn this into 1/5 is not a nice thing to do. All right. If you do want to turn a decimal into a fraction, here's the key. All values, all numbers, all letters, whatever you have, if you don't see a fraction, it's because there's an invisible one there. That's 0.2. If I write it over 1, that's me technically turned it into a fraction. The only thing is, we don't really want any decimals in a fraction, so we have to do something with this to make it look like that, or to make it look like this. That something is multiply top and bottom by 10, by 100, by 1,000, by as many tens as you need until this decimal place disappears. Well, if we multiply top and bottom of this by 10, 0.2 times 10 gives us 2, and 1 times 10 gives us 10, and we end up with 2/10. 2/10 is the same as 20 hundredths, is the same as 1/5. So, although this is not really the nicest conversion to do, turning a decimal into a fraction, basically what you do is you write the decimal over 1 and then times top and bottom by as many tens as needed. I'm just going to put here by tens until the decimal disappears. And as soon as you've done that, you will have a fraction. Whether or not it can be simplified afterwards, it depends on the fraction you end up with. So we times top and bottom by 10, we got 2/10, it can simplify. But whether or not you have 20 over 100, 2 over 10, 1 over 5, they're all fractions, so you're winning either way. Okay, so let's look at another example of that. 70% here. I want to turn 70% into a fraction. Well, 70%, the percent just means out of 100. So I can write this as 70 over 100. And in this case, that simplifies, giving us 7/10. If we divide this and this by 10, we end up with 7/10. 70% as a decimal. Now, turning this into a decimal, technically, you do exactly the same thing. This percent sign means divide by 100. So what you could do in another way of writing this is instead of putting the percent sign, here we wrote it over 100 as a fraction because we wanted a fraction. But if you want a decimal, you just got to actually do that sum. You've just got to take that 70, divide it by 100 and get an answer from that. And that answer ends up being 0.7 for this one. For, where are we now? I'm losing track. 3.2% here at the end. Percent sign means divide by 100. So for the decimal, I'm going to actually do that divide by 100 sign. For the fraction, I'm just going to write it over 100. At 3.2 goes before or on top of this fraction. It goes before that sum there. If I do 3.2 divided by 100, I'm going to get 0.032. That is our decimal. And this one, a little bit trickier. We don't want decimals in our fraction. So the same thing that we did back here is 0.2 over 1 times top and bottom by 10. This just needs to be simplified to make it look a little nicer. If we multiply top and bottom by 10 here, we're going to end up with 32 over 1,000. Now that technically simplifies, but I can't be bothered simplifying that right now. So 32 over 1,000, I'm just going to leave it like that. Lastly, 105%. So we can either write that as 105 over 100. We could leave it like that technically, or I can be bothered to simplify this one. Let's do it. 21/20ths is what that ends up becoming. So to fill in some of the blanks here, to turn a percentage into a fraction, what we do is we write it over 100. So we write over 100. And I should mention, we lose the percent sign. We basically replace the percentage sign with over 100. So that's that. And I'm missing something here. Percentage into a decimal. We technically do divide it by 100. So whatever the number is, we do the divide by 100. And then again, we lose this percentage sign. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you convert between fractions, decimals, and percentages. Some are easier than others. You'll find certain ones that work better for you. But anytime you have any of the three, fractions, decimals, or percentages, you can always convert into the other two. Hope this video was useful for you. Please let me know in the comments if you have any further questions. Feel free to point out if I happen to make any mistakes, so on and so forth. You know what, I can actually be bothered simplifying this now. So I'm just going to do this because that's how I roll. See how far we go down. 4 over 125. There we go, 4 over 125, that's what that is. Yeah, let us know any other topics that you want help on in the comments, and have a great day.